Continuing on with my read through of the Bible, I now come to the second book of Samuel. Now, despite being named the second book of Samuel, this is actually the King David story. As I said in my previous video, the reason that this is named Samuel comes from the Jewish tradition, where in the Jewish tradition, Samuel actually wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Through, I believe, the gift of prophecy, according to Wikipedia, there's also a tradition that the prophets Nathan and Gad helped to write some of the parts dealing with the reign of King David, but Samuel started writing the book. That's the Jewish tradition. It's not the Christian tradition. That was certainly not the tradition that I was brought up with, but that's where the book takes its name from. In fact, the Christian tradition is to treat these, I believe, as anonymous chronicles, and in the original Vulgate, it was named 1st and 2nd Kings, and then what we now call 1st and 2nd Kings would have been 3rd and 4th Kings. But in the Protestant Reformation, there was a move to align the Bible more closely to the Jewish texts, and that involved changing the name back to Samuel, and the Catholic Bible eventually followed suit, as referenced by the Bible I'm reading, the Jerusalem Bible, which is in fact a Catholic Bible, but going by the name of Samuel now. And as I said before in the previous video, in the Jewish tradition, this is all just one book. It wasn't broken up into 1st Samuel and 2nd Samuel until the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, what's known as the Septuagint. During the Greek-speaking era. I'm not sure when that would have been, around the 1st century BC, is that right? So in some ways, again, as I said in the previous video, it's a little bit it's a little bit artificial to break this into two separate books and two separate reviews. It's really just one continuous story. But there's so much to talk about that why not break it into two separate reviews? In fact, in my previous review, my review of 1st Samuel, I rambled on and on and on about everything that popped into my mind, and the camera that I'm using, the memory card gets full, the phone memory gets full after an hour, and the video just switched off after an hour and cut me off in mid-sentence right when I was talking about Saul and the Witch of Endor story. So apologies for that, and apologies in advance, because I have a feeling the same thing is going to happen here. There's just so much to talk about, and I'm doing this, as always, unscripted, so I'm probably going to make a mess of it and just talk about a bunch of random things as they come into my mind. And apologies in advance for all of that. As always, feel free not to watch, but if you do watch, hopefully at least something I say will be of interest or useful. Or if not, let me know in the comments about everything I get wrong. Okay, so the even though in the original Hebrew this is all just one book, in some ways this division does make a bit of sense, because it starts off with David learning of Saul's death. And so this is no longer the young fugitive David. This is the King David, who will establish his throne as David, King of Judah, and then shortly as King of all Israel. Also, in my review of 1 Samuel, I mentioned that one of the predominant characteristics of 1 Samuel is all the stories get repeated twice. That seems to be gone by 2 Samuel. So we're done with repeating everything twice, and we are moving into what is called by scholars either the court history or the succession narrative, which is possibly historical depending on who you talk to. Now, warnings in advance, I am totally going to go down this rabbit hole of exploring whether or not this is historical. So, and that will come, of course, at the expense of other things I might talk about, like literary themes and stuff like this. But I'm a history nerd. This is of interest to me. The Jerusalem Bible, which I've got here, says that the history of David's family and the disputed succession. Now this is 2 Samuel here, includes much eyewitness material, which goes back to the time of his son Solomon. Now, typically of the Jerusalem Bible, at least the Reader's Edition, which I have, they don't give their sources for this or show any of the proof. But they make the assertion that much of this is based on eyewitness material, which is in debate. But there are a number of people who do believe that the so-called court history is based on eyewitness material, including some atheists. So the prominent classicist Robin Lane Fox, whose book, The Unauthorized Version, Truth and Fiction in the Bible, it comes to mind as an atheist who I have read, who defends that this is probably historical material and eyewitness material. Now, again, somewhat frustratingly in his book, Robin Lane Fox doesn't really, to my mind, he doesn't prove that this is eyewitness material. He just says that it feels like eyewitness material. But then again, when you're talking about ancient history, maybe there is no real hard proof of anything. Maybe you do just have to go off of what things seem to be. So the reason this might seem to be historical is that King David is presented in the Bible and Jewish tradition as like the king of this golden age, right? This was the time when Israel was at the peak of its powers. God was happy with the king. It was a blessed, anointed king who was God's favorite, and it was a strong Israel. And if you go back in the prophets who come from a later age, they are all looking back on this as a golden age. So the further you get away from this in time, the later the sources are, the more they look back on this as a golden age period, which means there must have been some mythologizing done about this over time. So is Robin Lane Fox's theory. But when you actually read the account of King David, it presents a very flawed king. Somebody who makes a lot of mistakes, somebody who infamously sins with adultery and murder, with the case of Bathsheba and Uriah. Somebody who can't control his own family. He can't control his sons. He has a couple of sons rebel against him. And can't control his own nephews. In fact, his nephews, the sons of Zariah. Zariah is his sister, who has 3 sons, and one of them, Joab, is the leader of David's army, and David can't control him, or the other 2 for that matter, although one of them dies fairly early on. He goes and cries in his room where the other people do the fighting for him. He gets chewed out for this by Joab, although he also can't control Joab. Joab, I think by my count, kills 3 people in 2 Samuel that David had specifically forbidden him to kill, and he just goes ahead and does it anyways. So it's not really much of a portrait of a legendary king. It seems like this might be a very kind of warts and all portrait of a very flawed human being who might have been a very flawed human being. And that, I believe, is the argument for why this could be historical. Now, like I said, there's a lot of debate about this. And it's interesting to contemplate. I mean, what do you think? Just based on that, would you say this is probably historical, or would you say there's a good chance that it could be legendary? The parallel that sprung to my mind is the King Arthur story. So, just like the King David story, King Arthur uh, had a very legendary beginning and did great deeds in his youth, just like King David. Now, Robin Lane Fox says that the early King David stories, the stories in First Samuel, are most likely legendary because they're. Robin Lane Fox even uses the phrase "once and future king." He says it's too much like the once and future king. You know, this glorious, predestined young prince who is going on to do all this wonderful stuff. So Robin Lane Fox doesn't think the early King David stuff is historical, but he thinks the court history, the king part of the King David story is historical. But okay, anyways, both King Arthur and King David have glorious starts, but then both become weak in their old age. Both become manipulated by people around them. And both of them have trouble controlling their sons and their nephews. Uh, you know, King Arthur can't control his nephews during the end of his life, just like King David. King Arthur has to fight against his very own son, just like King David. King Arthur gets in trouble because he slept with somebody he shouldn't have slept with, just like King David, right? And now King Arthur, of course, is purely legendary, or if it is based on some historical figure, it's very, very loose, obviously. So that could be an argument why this kind of story could be legendary, except maybe you're thinking like I was. Well, King Arthur was written during the Christian era. So the writers of King Arthur knew the King David story and possibly modeled King Arthur on the King David story. Well, I got that idea in my head, and I did a Google search for was King Arthur modeled on the King David story, and I did find that I was not the first person to make the comparison between them. There are a lot of different web pages and blogs exploring the connections between King Arthur and King David. Some people have thought of things I didn't even think of, like Samuel is like Merlin, and things like that. But I couldn't find anything that said that the King Arthur story was actually based on the King David story. It seems to be like the parallels between them might just be coincidence. I don't know. But the other interesting thing about this, again, kind of thinking about its historical value or where do these stories come from, is much of the historical narrative of the Old Testament is telling a story with a moral. You follow God, Yahweh, you'll be rewarded. You worship false gods or you disobey Yahweh's commands, you're going to get righteously punished. But there is a lot of material in 2 Samuel about political alliances and intrigues for control of the throne, which don't seem connected to this overarching polemic. I suppose it doesn't necessarily mean they're historical. They could have just originated from an older legendary source. But here's one, right? So David is king of Judah, but he still has to fight for control of Israel. Now, Saul is dead, but Saul's son Ishbal has been taken over the command of Israel in David's absence, although Ishbal is appointed by Abner, who is Saul's army commander. Now, Abner is a name that has been in this story for a while. Abner popped up several times in 1 Samuel as Saul's army commander. We never really got a portrait of him, but he was a name that was there a lot. So okay, so we've got a civil war. Saul's army commander is refusing to give up just because Saul is dead. He wants to put on Ishbal as his puppet. And then they're fighting each other. And there's Abner, who's the commander of Saul's forces. And then there's Joab, who is also David's nephew, who's the commander of David's forces. And then as they're fighting, Abner said to Joab, "Let the young soldiers come forward and hold a contest before us." "Let them come forward," Joab replied. So they came forward and were numbered off, 12 from Benjamin for Ishbal, son of Saul. So Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin. And 12 of David's followers. So I guess the idea is, because this is a civil war, Israelites against Israelites, we're just going to try and cut down on the fratricidal bloodshed by just nominating 12 from each side to fight it out. But it doesn't work, because each caught his adversary by the head and drove his sword into his side, so that they all fell together. So all 24 of them just simultaneously fall down. Now this has got to be legend, right? I mean, if we're keeping track of what sounds mythical and what sounds historical, this sounds mythical. And in fact, I think there are stories like stories in Greek mythology of like Cadmus or something, like, which are very similar to this, right? And then we even have a folk etymology of where the name of the place, hence the place was called the Field of Sides. But okay, but put that aside, and then we get into the fighting. So they're fighting, and the three sons of Zeruiah, these are David's nephews, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was as swift-footed as a wild gazelle. Asahel set off in pursuit of Abner, turning neither to right nor to the left as he went in pursuit of him. Abner turned. "Asahel," he said, "is that you?" He answered, "It is." "Turn to your right or your left," Abner said. "Catch one of the soldiers and take his spoil." But Asahel would not break off the pursuit. Again Abner said to Asahel, "Stop pursuing me unless you want me to strike you to the ground. And then how could I look your brother Joab in the face again?" But he refused to turn away, so Abner struck him in the belly with the butt of his spear, so that the spear came out at his back, and he fell there and died on the spot. On coming to the place where Asahel had fallen and died, everyone halted. Now, I remember hearing about this story in Sunday school and seeing it illustrated in the Bible comics Pix, which those of you who grew up in Sunday schools might remember. If your church handed out picks every week. But anyways, point being, I remember being surprised by this story, because here is Asahel, who is one of David's men, David's nephew, who is fighting for David's cause, right? And Yahweh is supporting David's cause. So surely, according to the logic of the Bible, there should be some sort of good guy shield around Asahel, right? Doesn't Yahweh protect all the heroes who are fighting for him? But David's nephew gets killed and dies. And, it's presented here as just like, well, that's the breaks, You're fighting in the battle, you go up against somebody who's better than you. But you're like, well, wait a minute, didn't he have God on his side? That always used to confuse me as a kid. I said, but Asahel was the good guy. He was on David's side. How did God let him die? That's not usually the way it goes down in the Bible, right? Which could be an indication that this is historical. But then things get kind of a little bit Game of Thrones-ish, as there's a lot of intrigue for power. So Abner sleeps with one of Saul's concubines, and Ishbel sees this as an affront to his royalty. So he asks him, "Why have you slept with my father's concubine?" These words, Abner flies into a rage. and then defects over to David. Now, again, there's no greater moral here. It's not about false gods or following Yahweh's commandments or any of the usual polemic. It's just political backstabbing. And then the political backstabbing and intrigue goes even further, because Abner is going off to David. David immediately realizes what a coup this is. So he gets Abner. Not only is Abner a great general and will bring over Saul's people, but Abner can also bring over the rest of Israel. He's got like that respect. So David is overjoyed that Abner is coming with him. But Joab is furious, both because Abner has killed his brother and also because Abner seems to be taking his job. So Joab ambushes Abner and kills him. Ambush is the wrong word. He lures him into an embrace. So Abner reached Hebron. Joab drew him apart to the side of his gate as if to have a word with him in private, and there he struck him in the belly. And then, just to finish up with that story, and then Ishboel, once he's lost Abner, just gets murdered by the people in his palace, who just now regard him as too weak to stand against David. So those kind of intrigues, again, they don't seem to fit the simple narrative polemic of much of the Old Testament history. So, I guess it doesn't necessarily mean it's historical, but it's intriguing. And to come back to Joab, he himself is an interesting character, because he is on the side of David. He's portrayed as commanding David's armies. Well, David is back in the palace in Jerusalem. So, the first Ammonite campaign, Joab and Joab's brother, I believe, Abishai, so two of the brothers are left. One's dead. They are actually commanding the armies and winning the victories for God. And Joab has harsh words for David after the Absalom debacle. And Joab kills Absalom in defiance of David's order to spare him. And hopefully I'll have time to talk more about Absalom later in this video. We'll see how my timing works out. And so Joab ends up criticizing David for going into his room and crying when Absalom is dead. Then Joab went indoors to the king. Today, he said, you are covering the faces of all your servants with shame when they have saved your life today, and the lives of your sons and daughters, of your wives too, and your concubines, all because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. Today you have made it plain that commanders and soldiers mean nothing to you, since now I see that if Absalom were alive today and we all dead, you would be pleased. Now get up, come out, and reassure your soldiers. For if you do not come, I swear by Yahweh, not one man will stay with you tonight, and this will be a worse misfortune for you than all that has happened to you from your youth until now. So very harsh words, but you get the impression here that Joab is not wrong. That King David is acting irresponsibly by crying in his room, and Joab is the one who slaps him into place. Now, we don't actually get to see the end of the succession narrative or the end of the court history in 2 Samuel, because by maybe a somewhat puzzling editorial decision by the original editors of the Bible. The end of the succession narrative and the final intrigues between the David's two sons, Adonijah and Solomon, take place in the first couple chapters of First Kings. So we'll have to put a pin in that until I come back from my review of First Kings. But just to the final fate of Joab. David on his deathbed said, don't let Joab die peacefully in bed. There's blood on his hands and you need to kill him. And Solomon eventually does have Joab killed for a palace conspiracy. So, again, this is all different than the usual morality in the Old Testament, right? So Joab, he's a rough man, but he does what needs to be done. He's there when David needs him. Kills 3 people in defiance of David's orders in this book. I've talked about one of them already. 2 more, hopefully, I'll have time to get to. But yeah, what is meant to be the takeaway for this? I remember when I was studying these stories in my Christian school in grade 5, saying to my Bible teacher, so was Joab a good person or a bad person? How are we meant to feel about him by the time we get done with these stories? Taking all of this into account. Does he go down as one of the heroes or does he go down as one of the villains? Because that's quite typically the way we're meant to think about these biblical characters, at least in the Sunday school morality version. And my Bible teacher thought it was a very good question, and when during parent-teacher conferences, she made a point of telling my parents what a smart kid I was for asking these questions. But I never did get an answer to that. And it's an enigma that hangs over this story. And there's a lot of stuff like that. I'll try and point out a few more of that, a few more of those type of instances as we go through. But a lot of puzzling morality here, where it's not quite clear. Now, I guess, to be fair, a lot of the Old Testament in general is like that. There are a lot of puzzling stories where you're like, what are we meant to take away from this? But I think especially it's a little bit hard to tell who the good guys are and the bad guys are in 2 Samuel, or during the so-called court history. So again, maybe make that a point for this possibly being historical. So after David gets the throne, there's the capture of Jerusalem. Now, this is another interesting little question. When Jerusalem fell into Israelite control is something that the Old Testament narrative contradicts itself on. So in the book of Joshua, it's said that this whole territory was conquered by the Israelites. But then later we find out that Jerusalem was not conquered by the Israelites in Joshua. So in the book of Joshua, it appears to be a contradiction. Earlier in the historical narrative, it appears to be under the control of the Israelites, like in 1 Samuel. It's referred to as an Israelite city. So there appears to be a couple different traditions going on here. But those earlier contradictions aside, I guess this is a place in the historical narrative where Jerusalem is captured by David's men. Now, this is an interesting little example, maybe, of how traditions get built around this text. So the Jebusites are living in Jerusalem. So David and his men marched on Jerusalem against the Jebusites living there. These said to David, "You will not get in here. The blind and the lame will hold you off." That is to say, David will never get in there. But David captured the fortress of Zion, that is the citadel of David. That day, David said, "Whoever strikes the Jebusites and goes by the conduit. Sorry, whoever strikes the Jebusites and goes up by the conduit. As for the blind and lame, David hated them in his soul. So, just reading that, David said, whoever strikes the Jebusites and goes up by the conduit. What would you take away from that? I mean, I would take nothing away from that. Okay, some sort of thing, a conduit, whatever that means, blah, 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 blah. Keep reading. But it's often portrayed that David and his men got into Jerusalem by going through the water pipes. For example, the Picts, the comic book versions of the Bible, which were handed out in my Sunday school, portrayed Joab and his men, I guess. I believe it was Joab in the comic book version, going through the water pipes to infiltrate the city. In The Secret Chord by, I forget the author, which is also a novelization of the King David story. There's like 10 pages or something describing how they managed to go through the water pipes. So just kind of these 5 little words here, goes up by the conduit, gets fleshed out by later writers as to be this whole military campaign where they go through the water pipes. But it's very vague when you actually read it here. I always thought that was kind of interesting. So you'll excuse the digression. And then, speaking of little rabbit holes of things that I think are interesting, we get to Jonathan's son, Mirabel. So David and Jonathan, of course, had a very close relationship. David was very close with Saul's family in general, despite the fact that Saul kept trying to kill him. So David wanted to do something for Saul's family, and there was a cripple named Mirabel. Now, you're probably thinking, that's not the name. The name is Mephibosheth. What's it doing with Mirabel here? So this is interesting, and this is appears to be just something that the Jerusalem Bible has done. They've chosen to translate Mephibosheth as Mirabel. So I looked it up on Wikipedia. Wikipedia says that it's referred to as Mirabel in the book of Chronicles, but in 2 Samuel, the name is Mephibosheth. And there's another name which pops up in some variants, which is like Mirimbal or something like that. It's kind of, there's like an M and a PH here inserted in the middle. But yeah, I guess what's going on, one of the theories is that the name was originally Mirabal or Mirimbal or some sort of variation on that. And the ball here, Baal at the end, is a reference to the Canaanite god Baal. Baal. How is it pronounced? Baal, I think, is how it's usually pronounced, right? Now, I guess it appears that during a lot of Israelites' history, there were multiple gods that were being worshipped. Yahweh was just one of the gods being worshipped. Baal was another one. Now, when the Old Testament history is being written, it's being presented as this polemic. Baal is evil, Yahweh is good. Anyone who worships Baal is evil. Anyone who worships Yahweh is good. But this doesn't. This polemic appears to be like a later viewpoint being projected backwards into all these traditions. And we saw that when we were looking at the book of Judges. If you go back and look at my review of that, or actually you don't have to listen to my review of that. But one of Gideon's names, his alternative name, also references Baal. And there's an explanation for that given in the text, but then the footnotes in the Jerusalem Bible say this is actually just a folk etymology. Actually, the name really does mean somebody who supports Baal. So this appears to be another example of that, which is why in 2 Samuel the name got changed to Mephibosheth to try and delete the reference to Baal, even though in Chronicles that got left in. But I find it very interesting that the Jerusalem Bible just went ahead and changed it to Marabal, because apparently it is Mephibosheth in 2 Samuel. And I find it even more interesting that they did that without even a footnote. They just said, yep, his name is Marabal. I mean, even if you could make the historical case that the actual original figure was Marabal instead of Mephibosheth, surely the weight of tradition would make you want to call it Mephibosheth in the English translation, right? And then just maybe have a footnote somewhere saying there's good evidence that his character was originally named Marabal. I mean, right? When you're doing an English version of this, you refer to these characters as they're commonly known in English, right? You wouldn't call Jesus Yeshua in an English translation of the Bible, even though Yeshua was actually the original historical name. Anyways. But speaking of Mephibosheth or Marabal, this is another little interesting thing, because when Absalom takes the throne from David, one of Mephibosheth's servants comes out. Let me see if I can find it. Comes out, Ziba, who's Merabal's servant or Mephibosheth's servant, comes out. Now, Marabal or Mephibosheth has stayed in Jerusalem, where Absalom is coming. And the king asks, why has he stayed in Jerusalem? And Ziba, Mephibosheth's servant, says, the house of Israel will give me back my father's kingdom today. So Mephibosheth is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks that he's going to be restored to Saul's throne. So David realizes he's been betrayed, and he says to Ziba, all that Marabal owns is now yours. Now, later, after Absalom is defeated, David meets Marabal again. Sorry, I'm just going to call him Marabal, I guess, instead of Mephibosheth. He said, the Lord my king, my servant deceived me. Your servant said to him, saddle my donkey, I shall ride it out to go with the king, for your servant is lame. And the servant just left him there, took his donkey. Mephibosheth is lame, so he can't go out after him. Sorry, I guess I'm going to switch between Mephibosheth and Marabal. Sorry, I get mixed up. Anyways, so Mephibosheth or Marabal is telling a different story about how he got left behind because he was lame. His servant saddled up the donkey and left without him, even though he had requested to go out to David, and then the servant slandered him. And David said, why say any more? I rule that you and Ziba are to share the property. Oh, sorry, I left out a key detail here. Once David learns from Ziba that Mephibosheth has betrayed him, David says, all that Marabal owns is now yours. Ziba said, my homage, Lord King, may I deserve your favor. So he transfers all of... David had restored Mephibosheth's property to him, or given him a lot of property when he took him into his household as a kindness to Jonathan's family. He gives that to Ziba now when he thinks Mephibosheth has betrayed him, but then when he hears Mephibosheth's version, he says, okay, you and your servant share it. Which I thought, well, that's kind of strange. I mean, the servant slanders Mephibosheth, rides out without him, and tells a lie to David. Why doesn't David have the servant killed or give all the property back to Mephibosheth? But he splits it between them. So I looked this up on Wikipedia again. And Wikipedia says that this seems to indicate David's not quite sure who to trust, which story is true, which is, again, an unusual point of view to have in the Old Testament histories, right? Normally, the narrator will tell you whose side you're supposed to be on and who's, the good guy and who's the bad guy. So this ambiguity here that David never really finds out who was telling the truth, and we, the reader, never really find out who is telling the truth. You could put that maybe in the point of, okay, well, maybe this is historical. Maybe this is based on eyewitness documents with the court history, because it's just kind of leaving these questions hanging unanswered. And there are quite a few of these types of things. And again, I'm probably going to run out of time before I get to talk about all of them, but try and talk about as much of them as I can. Okay, there's the famous story here about David and Bathsheba, which I'm largely going to cross over because I think that's already been talked about so much. I'm not sure I'd have anything really to say about it. Other than what's going to follow next is, as I've already indicated, David having trouble controlling his sons. So David versus Absalom. In a way that, as I said before, doesn't seem to fit neatly into the polemic that the Old Testament narrative is usually going for. It's just David is getting overthrown by his son for no real reason. It has nothing to do with worshiping Baal or turning to false gods or any of the normal reasons for Israelites getting oppressed. Except that when David is rebuked by Nathan says, I will stir up evil for you out of your own house. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to your neighbors, blah, 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 blah. So he's saying you're going to have trouble within your own household as this punishment. And then I guess this is the trouble David has in his own household. So I guess it kind of does fit into the Old Testament religious polemic that way, although I wouldn't be surprised if this is like a later prefix that was added to the Absalom story to kind of have it make more sense. So they had this story about Absalom rebelling against David, and to try and fit it into the Old Testament polemic, maybe they added this bit later. That's just me thinking out loud, but could explain stuff, right? And then the Absalom narrative, it's easy sometimes to forget how bizarre the beginning of the Absalom narrative is. And again, well, what to make of this? What do you think? So it starts off with Ammon, who's another one of David's sons. And Ammon rapes Tamar, who is his half-sister, or depending on which commentary you read, maybe not his sister. Maybe Tamar is Absalom's half-sister. But I some of the commentaries were saying that Tamar came from a previous mother before that mother married David. So I guess no blood relations to Ammon as well. Ammon at all, but raised up as part of the household as if they were brothers and sisters. Ammon becomes infatuated with Tamar, and then after this long infatuation, eventually rapes her. So this is another case why the Bible is not always for children, huh? We've got another one of several rape stories in the Bible. So then this is going to be the cause of why Absalom hates Ammon, and this is kind of what sets off the whole Absalom story in motion. So what do you make of that? Historical, legendary, what it the thing that makes me think it's maybe legendary is that immediately after raping her, then Ammon was seized with extreme hatred for her. The hatred he now felt for her was greater than his earlier love. Get up and go, he said. No, my brother, she said, to send me away would be a greater wrong than the other you have done me. But he would not listen to her. So that sounds like it's out of a folk tale, right? That kind of extreme cruelty, where not only does he rape her, but then immediately his love for her disappears, and he I mean, not only does his love for her disappear, but he cruelly throws her out in dishonor. I mean that seems like it's exaggerated for effect as in a folk tale. Um, but then, yeah, Absalom killing Ammon in this disorder among David's house, which is interesting because we have this whole little prequel with Absalom. And this is another thing that people often forget about the Absalom story. Or I guess when I say people, I mean me. I often forget this. Maybe you do as well. Joab was the one who negotiates for the return of Absalom initially. I mean, I remember this, I guess, because this was a big plot point in the Secret Chord, the novelization of the King David story, which made me go back and check the original Bible, and yes, it was in there. Now, of course, Joab is going to be the one who later urges David to be harsh with Absalom and ends up killing Absalom against David's orders. So, but there's all this palace intrigue. I guess this is why they call this a succession narrative. So Ammon rapes Tamar, Absalom kills Ammon, the rest of David's sons flee, Absalom has to flee, Joab negotiates for the return of Absalom. Again, all these kind of changing and shifting alliances, kind of like Game of Thrones type stuff, right? And this is, again, why I like to think there could be a really good TV series made about the King David story. I mean, I know all the ones that they've tried so far have flopped, but there's enough story in here. If somebody just figured out the way to adapt it, maybe eventually somebody would. But the thing about Absalom, which makes me think he is more legendary, leaning towards the legendary side of the spectrum, is Absalom's hair. So in the whole of Israel, there was no man who could be praised for his beauty as much as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was not a blemish on him. When he cut the hair of his head, and he would cut it every year, he would cut it then because it grew too heavy for him. He would weigh the hair 200 shekels, the king's weight. To Absalom were born 3 sons. Now, I believe this is going to be a contradiction later, because when Absalom dies, it's going to say he doesn't have a son. Should we check that a minute? Somewhere near his death, it's going to say that. Oh, yeah. Now Absalom during his lifetime had undertaken the erection of the pillar to himself, which is in the valley of the king. I have no son, he said, so to preserve my memory of my name. So, okay. In case anyone's keeping track of contradictions. Yeah, this Absalom and his long, beautiful hair seemed legendary. And of course, this is Chekhov's hair. Because after being set up earlier, of course, this is going to come into the famous scene where Absalom gets his hair stuck in the tree and ends up just hanging from the oak by his hair. which is a story, of course, I always had trouble visualizing or comprehending when I was learning this in Sunday school as a child. Maybe you did as well. I'd be like, but why? Why didn't he just pull his hair out of the tree? Why didn't he just cut himself down? I just couldn't imagine him trapped by his own hair in a tree and left hanging there until he finally gets killed. And now reading this as an adult, I think this is okay. This is probably legendary, at least maybe that part of it. The Absalom story, I'd forgotten how much of 2 Samuel it takes up. So starting here with Ammon raping Tamar, who's Absalom's sister, we go from 2 Samuel 13, Absalom flees court, Joab negotiates for him to come back, Absalom comes back, now we're in 2 Samuel 15, Absalom's intrigues, Absalom's rebellion, 2 Samuel 16, 2 Samuel 17, 2 Samuel 18, 2 Samuel 19. Now, sorry. Briefly lost my train of thought there. Robin Lane Fox, again, someone who's an atheist, but thinks the King David story is historical and thinks that this so-called court history is based on eyewitness documents. Remember, his whole thing is that King David is heavily mythologized in later ages. But if you actually look at King David's reign itself, it's not nearly as glorious as the later prophets would misremember it. He notes just how many rebellions there are against David. So, I mean, there's David's son Absalom who rebels against him, but it's not only Absalom. All of Israel kind of flocks to Absalom. And a lot of David's inner circle flock to Absalom as well. David's advisors. How do you pronounce this? Ahithophel. David's top advisor, who was regarded as like the wisest man in the land, goes over to Absalom. And then there's, right after Absalom, there's another revolt, the revolt of Sheba, a Benjamite, which attracts a lot of, at this time, all of the men deserted David. All of the men of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba. So what he says is kind of reading between the lines of this is that King David actually was not a popular king during his lifetime. The people just kept rising up and rebelling against him, whether it was under Absalom or whether it was under Sheba. But we get to another interesting point here because Absalom's general was another one of King David's nephews. Now, it wasn't one of Joab's brothers. It appears to be a nephew of his by another sister, although it's a little bit, Absalom put Amasa in command of the army in place of Joab. This Amasa was the son of a man called Ithra the Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Jesse, and the sister of Zeruiah, Job's mother. Now, notice that that's a bit of a strange way of saying it. Jesse, of course, is David's father, but it doesn't say the sister of David. It says the sister of Zeruiah, Job's mother. But Jesse is David's father, so it must have been David's sister as well, right? Well, again, I looked this up on Wikipedia, and there are various explanations as to what exactly her relationship was to David. But whether or not it was a blood sister, it was somebody in David's family. So Amasa is, I guess, either another nephew of David or somebody in David's family. So count this as another nephew that David has trouble controlling. But then after David defeats Absalom, David puts Amasa as the head of his army. Now where is it? I don't remember the verse, but when David comes back, he puts Amasa as the head of his army over Joab. No explanation given. Perhaps this is one way to try and win over Israel, because remember, most of Israel went over to Absalom instead of with David. So maybe this is a way to kind of win over Absalom's followers by taking Amasa as the general of David's army. But of course, we know who's not going to like that, and that's Joab. And then there's the revolt of Sheba. So Sheba the Benjamite has revolted against David. Amasa is now head of the army, not Joab. So the king said to Amasa, "Summon the men of Judah to me, and be here yourself within 3 days." Amasa went to summon Judah, but he delayed beyond the time David had fixed. Why? It doesn't say. Then David said to Abishai. Now again, this is another one of the sons of Zeruiah, one of Joab's brothers. Sheba, son of Birch, is more dangerous to us than ever. Blah 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 blah. So Amasa is not amassing the troops like he's supposed to. Then Joab goes over to meet Amasa, comes over to face. Joab says to Amasa, "Are you well, my brother?" With his right hand, he took Amasa by the beard to kiss him. Amasa paid no attention to the sword Joab was holding, presumably because they're kinsmen. And Joab struck him with it in the belly and spilled his entrails on the ground. He did not need to strike a second blow, and so Amasa died. So this is another little piece of just kind of casual violence by Joab that doesn't seem to fit the polemic of Yahweh good, false gods bad. I mean, what are we meant to say about this? Then nothing happens. Joab takes control of the army and defeats the rebellion. But then the other thing is, why was Amasa delaying? And if you go again, I'm referencing Wikipedia on this. Sorry, I'm. What can I say? I'm not a scholar. I'm just a casual reader who goes to the internet when I get confused. But it looks like it's not clear why Amasa was delaying to summon the men, but Amasa may have been hoping the rebellion was going to succeed, or may have been in league with the rebellion. And Joab may have killed him because he realized Amasa was a traitor. I mean, that's all, I guess, people theorizing, but there's no explanation in the text, so you have to make your theories, right? It makes about as much sense as anything. But then why isn't that spelled out in the text? Well, again, this could be because the eyewitness source that this was based on, if we're going to lend credence to the theory that this is based on an eyewitness source again, is just kind of reporting what's happening, but doesn't know who's in the right and who's in the wrong. Just like David never did figure out whether Mephibosheth was lying or not. We never did figure out what Amasa was planning to do when he delayed with amassing the army. We never did figure out why Joab killed him. Yeah, I should mention, actually, I'm just about to run out of time here on this camera. We'll see how far into this I get. But there are a lot of other reasons for thinking that this is not historical. So apparently the boundaries of King David's kingdom described in the Bible does not match the archaeological evidence. There are several anachronisms in here, both in terms of where the countries were located at this time in history, and the types of armor and weapons being used. The very fact that David's army is being run always by his nephews seems to indicate a tribal chieftain type organization and not a big kingdom. So that could indicate that this is purely legendary and not historical at all, or maybe that it has, I don't know. I guess you could still say that it started out historical. There's a core of historical to it. I don't know. Tell me what you think. Is it historical or not? Um, okay. Then at the very end of 2 Samuel, we get supplemental information, which, again, I'm finding the notes in the Jerusalem Bible to be quite informative, because the Bible I grew up on, the NIV, never pointed any of this out. But it says, this narrative is detached from its context, and the events are probably to be placed before chapter 9, verse 1. The whole of the next 4 chapters of supplementary information interrupts the long story of David's family, which was resumed in 1 Kings. So like I said, the famous succession narrative is not actually going to finish at the end of 2 Samuel. We'll hold on to that until we get to 1 Kings. But then we've got various chapters of supplemental information here. A rather brutal story about how Saul's sons, surviving sons, are put to death to appease the Gibeonites. Now, this is interesting for a number of different reasons. One is it's the Gibeonites again, who we met in the book of Joshua. So these are the Gibeonites who had been originally Canaanites, had tricked Joshua into signing the treaty. And because Joshua had signed the treaty with them, and the treaty couldn't be broken, the Gibeonites were allowed to stay in the land of Canaan without being killed, but they were condemned to be slaves. So second-class citizens in the land of Israel. So that always kind of struck me as I said when I did my review of Joshua, that story always struck me as a little bit strange. I mean, so much of the Old Testament is strange. But you feel sorry for the Gibeonites. All they wanted to do was survive. And they're reduced to this trickery, and then they're reduced to becoming slaves. Now we find out that during Saul's reign, Saul had persecuted the Gibeonites. Now where's the explanation for this? Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to crush them. Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to crush them. So now that the story of Saul trying to crush them is, unless I missed something, not in the narrative. This is just the first time we're finding out about it. But I guess because the Gibeonites were not Israelites, not God's chosen people, Saul, and to the end of his life, Saul was still trying to serve Yahweh. He was kind of an interesting figure that way. The other bad kings in the Old Testament narrative, your Ahabs and your Ahazes and your other bad kings, they were actively worshiping false gods. Saul never did that. Saul was always trying to get back into Yahweh's favor. He had lost Yahweh's favor by not following Yahweh's instructions to the letter, but not because he worshipped false gods. So, anyways, presumably he's doing this in his zeal to serve Yahweh and to get rid of the Canaanite people in the land of Israel. But because he had been overzealous, Yahweh puts a famine on the land until the Gibeonites are avenged. And so then Saul's sons are handed over, 7 are impaled, and there's a story about how their mother kept watch over their bodies to keep the birds from eating them. Kind of a gruesome and sad story here, but an interesting little coda to the Gibeonites. Speaking of the Gibeonites, if you go back and watch my review of the book of Joshua, I think I messed up when I said one of the Gibeonites later became one of David's mighty men, because we get a list of David's mighty men or David's champions over here, and there are no Gibeonites among them. So I double checked this. In the book of Chronicles, not Samuel, but in Chronicles, one of the Gibeonites is listed as one of David's early supporters after the list of David's champions is given. And I think that's what I had misremembered as one of the Gibeonites being one of David's mighty men. So one of David's earliest supporters was a prominent Gibeonite in the book of Chronicles. Anyways, back here, we get interesting little details here. Again, another one of David's troublesome nephews, Abishai, son of Zeruiah, who saved David's life. So this is a bizarre little story, but interesting. Once again, the Philistines made war on Israel. David went down with the guards. They pitched camp at Goeb and fought the Philistines. Then there arose Dodo, son of Joash, a descendant of Rapha. His spear weighed more than 300 shekels of bronze. He was wearing a new sword, and he was confident he could kill David. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, went to his rescue. He struck down the Philistine and killed him. It was then that David's men urged him, "You must never go to battle with us," they said, "in case you put out the lamp of Israel." So, just an interesting little episode here that were it properly adapted into a movie or TV miniseries, you could make much more of this, obviously. And in her book, The Secret Chord, the author, whose name I'm blanking on, does flesh this incident out much more clearly. And assuming the Jerusalem Bible is right, that this information actually probably takes place before chapters 9, verse 1, then this could explain why David wasn't actually in the field fighting during Absalom's rebellion, why he stayed inside of the palace crying instead, while Joab went out to fight Absalom. And speaking of interesting little things that could make that are really fascinating, when we get to David's champions, we talk about the three, and we get the legendary deeds of the three. So there's a list of 37 champions, which include, interesting enough, Uriah the Hittite, and again, David's nephews here. Asahel, the brother of Joab, who was, this is the one that got killed by Abner at the beginning of 2 Samuel. And then the other brother, Abishai, who was strong with the spear, but he was no rival for the three. So here are the three champions who all did great deeds. So there are a number of David's champions. Ishabol, the Hachemite leader of the three, it was he who wielded his battle axe against 800 whom he killed at one time. Okay, so that could be another good episode if we were making this into a TV miniseries. After him, there is Eliezer, son of Dodo, the Alahite, one of the three champions. He was with David at Pastamen when the Philistines mustered for battle there. In the middle of Israel retreated before them, but he stood his ground and struck down the Philistines until his hand was so numb that it stuck to the sword. And then the last one, after him there was Shammah, son of Elah, the Hararite. The Philistines had mustered at Lehi. There was a field full of lentils there. I don't know why that's important. The army took flight before the Philistines, but he positioned himself in the middle of the field, defended it, and struck down the Philistines. So Yahweh brought him a great victory. So the three are all individually famous for these great acts, but then they all team up to get David a cup of water from a well in Jerusalem. So David is fighting the Philistines. He's under siege, maybe? It's a little bit unclear. So he wants a drink of water from the well in Bethlehem. The three champions fight their way through the Philistine camp, get the water, and then fight their way back to David to give it to him. And David ends up not drinking it. And this is the deeds of the three. And then the other legendary men here. And then the very last story is a rather bizarre story about a census in which David makes a census David decides to take a census. Joab tries to talk him out of it. So put this as another point in Joab's a good guy column for trying to keep track of, sort out whether he's a good or bad guy. Joab tries to talk David out of it. I guess we're counting this as a good guy point for Joab simply because the Bible is framing the census as a bad idea. It's not clear why the census is a bad idea. I believe the reasons my Bible school teachers gave us for this was because David was trying to count up how many men he had in his army, so he was wanting to rely on his own strength instead of relying on God's strength, which was a great sin. And then there's a pestilence and God's forgiveness, and an altar is built, etc. But I have talked way too much, haven't I? And I know I've talked way too much because I'm beginning to lose coherence. Apologies for that. I'm starting to say the wrong words, and the words I want to say are getting mixed up in my mouth. I'm surprised the camera hasn't stopped yet. Usually it cuts out at an hour mark. I've got an extra 10 minutes here. Okay, I actually said most of what I wanted to say here. And the last parts of David's life will have to wait till the book of Kings. But I'll finish off here.